Think about the most important medical decisions being made right now.
Huh.
Your doctor choosing a treatment or policymakers deciding on healthcare spending.
Yeah, big decisions.
And well, at the heart of those decisions, you often find randomized clinical trials, RCTs. They're held up as the gold standard, right?
Yeah.
The best evidence we supposedly have.
Supposedly, yes, that's the ideal.
But what if the very foundation, the integrity of those trials is, well, less solid than we think? There's this growing unease, even claims that many trials might be, faked or flawed.
And that's a deeply concerning prospect because, like you said, so much hangs on these studies.
Exactly.
Patient care, public health policies, huge amounts of money. It all relies on being able to actually trust the results from these RCTs.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we're shifting focus a bit, not just the trials themselves, but kind of the rule book for the trials. We're looking at a systematic review published in the journal Submergent. And it specifically investigated the quality of the documents that offer guidance, recommendations on research integrity within clinical trials.
So meta-research, looking at the quality of the guidance itself.
Precisely. Our mission today is really to unpack what this study found about, the strength, the scope of the guidance that's meant to protect the research underpinning evidence-based medicine.
And understanding how robust this guidance is, or maybe isn't, is crucial for basically everyone. Anyone who uses medical research, funds it, conducts it, or is just, well, affected by it, which is all of us, really.
Right. So let's quickly set the stage. Why are RCTs considered the cornerstone? Why is their integrity just non-negotiable?
Well, RCTs are generally seen as the most robust way to test if something actually works, like a new drug or therapy. The key is randomization.
Randomization. Yeah.
It helps minimize bias. So ideally, you can be more confident that any difference you see between groups is really down to the treatment and not some other factor. When done right, they give the most reliable answers on effectiveness.
And yet, it seems we have a problem brewing. We're seeing more retractions of scientific papers, right? Often linked to misconduct allegations.
That's right. The trend is worrying.
Our source mentioned a survey where up to 33.7%, almost a third of scientists admitted to questionable research practices. That figure just jumps out.
It really does. And the real-world consequences aren't trivial. There's a financial cost, for sure. The U.S. Office of Research Integrity estimated something like $58 million in NIH funding was linked to retracted papers just between 92 and 2012.
Wow.
But honestly, the human cost is far greater. Flawed or, dishonest research can lead to bad treatments being used or even harmful ones, and healthcare resources get wasted.
So trustworthiness isn't just a nice to have.
No, absolutely not. It's fundamental for patient safety, for good policy, everything.
Which means we desperately need clear, strong, coordinated guidance.
Yeah.
From everyone involved, institutions, journals, funders, regulators.
Everyone needs to be on the same page, ideally.
But the big question this study asks is that guidance we rely on actually good enough?
That's the core question, yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack this study then. How did these researchers actually go about assessing the quality of the recommendations? Not the trials, but the recommendations for integrity.
Right. So they did what's called a systematic review. It's a very structured way of finding and analyzing existing information.
Okay.
They searched multiple databases, Scopus, PubMed, Google Scholar, and also relevant websites. They were looking for publicly available documents, guidelines, consensus statements, anything offering recommendations specifically for research integrity in human clinical trials.
And they had a cutoff date.
Yeah, they searched everything published up to July 2023. They started with, I think, over 1,300 potential papers and things.
Wow, okay.
And they narrowed it down through screening to 14 specific recommendation documents that really fit their criteria for the final analysis.
14 documents meant to guide integrity. And how did they evaluate the quality of those 14?
They used established appraisal tools. Think of them like detailed quality checklists designed for assessing guidelines or consensus statements.
Okay, so standardized tools.
Exactly. They looked at things like, is the scope clear? Are the methods explained? Is it comprehensive? They adapted 3 tools slightly: agree to, write, and accord.
Agree to, write, accord. Can you briefly say what those check for?
Sure. Agree to assesses the overall methodological quality of guideline development. Write focuses on the completeness of reporting for guidelines. And accord, which was actually still under development at the time they did the study.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but it proved useful. It specifically looks at how well consensus-based recommendations are reported. They used all 3 to get a rounded picture.
Right, and they scored them. How do they classify the quality?
They did. They used percentage scores based on the checklists. Generally, 70% or higher was classified as good quality, 69% was average, and below 50% was poor.
Below 50% is poor. Got it.
And importantly, they had multiple reviewers assess the documents independently, and their agreement was really high, like 86 to 100%.
Okay, so that adds confidence to the findings.
Definitely.
So here's the moment. After putting these 14 documents, these integrity rulebooks, through this rigorous appraisal, what did the study actually find about their quality?
Well, this was the central and honestly quite surprising finding.
Yeah.
The vast majority, 11 out of the 14 documents, that's 78%, were classified as poor quality, according to all three of the appraisal tools they used.
Wait, poor quality on all three checklists. Not just one, but all of them.
For 11 out of 14, yes. Poor across the board.
Wow. So nearly 80% of the guidance documents designed to ensure trustworthy trials are themselves, well, low quality.
That's essentially what these findings suggest. It's a bit shocking, really.
Were there any good ones?
Yes, there were a few bright spots, relatively speaking. The top-rated one was the International Multi-Stakeholder Consensus Statement on Clinical Trial Integrity.
Okay.
That one actually scored good on all three, 70% on agree to, 96% on right, and 88% on accord. So that one stood out.
All right, one clear positive example. What about others? You said 11 were poor.
Right. Another one they mentioned, development of consensus on essential virtues, got average on agree to, 51%, but good on right, 71%, and accord, 77%. So a mixed bag there.
Okay, average to good.
But then you look at something like the Hong Kong Principles for Assessing Researchers. That scored just 19% on agree to, clearly poor.
19%. Ouch.
Yeah. Though, interestingly, it got 57% on right, average, but then only 10% on accord, poor.
Why the big difference sometimes, like between the agree score and the right score there?
The researcher suggests it's likely because agree to is probably the strictest tool. It covers more domains, more aspects of development, and it doesn't have an unclear option, like right sometimes does, forcing a judgment.
Ah, okay, so it's a tougher grader, essentially.
Pretty much. And they noted that accord, despite being new, seemed to perform accurately in identifying reporting flaws in consensus methods.
Okay, so the headline is, most guidance is poor quality. But beyond that overall score, did the study look at the actual content? Like what topics were covered, even in the weaker documents?
Yes, they did. That was the other key part of their analysis. They looked at weak aspects of the whole RCT lifecycle these documents actually addressed.
And did most offer some kind of specific guidance?
Most did, yes. 13 out of the 14 documents, so 93%, did offer some specific recommendations relevant to fostering integrity in trials.
Okay. So what were the common themes? What did they tend to cover most often?
The things you might expect, maybe. Funding disclosure was mentioned in about 79% of them.
Right, transparency about who paid for it.
Exactly. Authorship and specifying contributions, who did what that was, in 57%. Declaration of conflicts of interest, about 36%. Data sharing policies were in 64%. And things around editorial processes and peer review were mentioned in about 36% too.
So funding, authorship, conflicts, data sharing, peer review, those are definitely important areas for integrity.
Absolutely. They're core issues.
But, and this feels like a crucial point, what about the areas that were not well covered? Where were the gaps? What did the guidance miss?
This is, I think, one of the most critical takeaways from the entire study. The areas identified as having the weakest coverage, the biggest blind spots in the guidance documents, were patient and public involvement,
Okay, PPI.
outcomes definition, and sample size estimation.
Patient involvement, defining the outcomes, and figure out the sample size.
Yeah.
Those sound, well, pretty fundamental to doing a good trial, let alone an ethical one.
Exactly. That's why it's so striking that these areas are weak points in integrity guidance.
Can you elaborate a bit? Why are those specific things so critical for integrity?
Okay, take patient and public involvement, or PPI. It's crucial because research should ultimately benefit society, right? Involving patients helps ensure the questions being asked are actually relevant to them, that the trial design makes sense for participants, that the outcomes measured matter to patients.
So it's about relevance and applicability?
Yes, and respect for participants too. If the guidance on integrity doesn't emphasize this, it suggests maybe it's not seen as a core integrity issue, which seems wrong.
Okay, what about defining outcomes?
Outcomes definition is critical. Researchers need to decide before the trial starts exactly how they're going to measure success or failure. What specific result are they looking for?
Pre-specification, yeah.
Right. If you don't define that clearly up front, There's a huge temptation or risk, let's say, to look at all the data afterwards and pick the outcome that looks best. It's called outcome switching or cherry picking.
Which is obviously a major integrity problem.
Yeah.
It misrepresents the findings.
A huge integrity issue. And sample size estimation. That's about statistical power. You need enough participants to reliably detect a real difference if one actually exists.
If the trial's too small.
If it's too small, you might get a false negative, you miss a real effect, or the results might just be unstable and unreliable. Conducting an underpowered trial is often considered unethical because you expose participants to risks without a good chance of getting a meaningful answer.
So, patient involvement, clear outcomes up front, and proper sample size.
Yeah.
These aren't just good scientific practice, they are fundamental to the trustworthiness and ethical conduct of the trial.
Absolutely. And yet, according to this review, these are the areas where the guidance documents specifically focused on integrity are weakest. That's a major disconnect.
Yeah, that is really telling.
The study also made another interesting point about how these guidance documents are often created. Many rely on consensus methods, getting experts together to agree on recommendations.
Which sounds reasonable on the surface.
It can be, but the review pointed out that this consensus process often lacks a rigorous, systematic search for external evidence to back up the recommendations. Meaning the recommendations might be based more on the opinions or experiences of the specific experts in the room, rather than being grounded in a thorough review of what's already known from previous research or evidence.
So that could introduce bias into the guidance itself.
Exactly. It could lead to recommendations that are inaccurate, incomplete, or potentially even misleading, even if they represent a consensus.
Okay, so stepping back. What does all this mean? If the actual guidance meant to ensure the integrity of these crucial trials is often low quality and misses key elements like patient involvement or outcome definition, how do we fix this? How do we improve the trustworthiness of the trials we rely on?
Well, the clear message is that there's significant room for improvement. A lot of improvement needed in both the quality and the reporting of these guidance documents.
It's not good enough right now.
It seems not, based on this evidence. Building trust, or perhaps rebuilding trust, in evidence-based medicine requires a really concerted effort from all the stakeholders in that RCT lifecycle we talked about.
Institutions, funders.
Researchers, journals, regulators, patient groups, everyone. The guidance itself needs to be much more robust, much more comprehensive, and developed using better, more transparent methods.
And based on the findings, we know where to start focusing on.
Precisely. The findings really highlight an urgent need for maybe international benchmarks for RCT integrity standards. And these need to be established through expert consensus, yes, but using transparent, evidence-informed methodology, not just opinion.
Right. Learning from the critique in the study.
Exactly. And those weak points they identified, patient involvement, outcomes definitions, sample size, they basically give us a roadmap. That's where future guidance development really needs to concentrate.
It also sounds like we need better ways to assess trial integrity itself.
Yes, the study mentioned that too. There's a need for better tools, not just for creating guidance, but for people like systematic reviewers who synthesize trial evidence, or journal editors deciding what to publish. They need robust ways to gauge the integrity of the studies they're looking at.
Could technology play a role there? AI, maybe?
Potentially. The authors mention AI might assist in this complex task down the line, helping to scan papers for integrity indicators or red flags. And they also highlighted that new checklist, Accord.
The one for consensus reporting.
Yeah, they suggested it looks promising for improving how consensus-based methods are reported in the future, which could help improve transparency and quality overall.
Okay. So this deep dive has really uncovered something quite unsettling. We put enormous faith in randomized clinical trials.
We have to, in many ways.
But the actual rule books, the guidance documents meant to ensure their integrity, often seem to be low quality and miss crucial components, particularly around things like involving patients, defining outcomes properly beforehand, and making sure trials are statistically sound.
It's a stark finding, and it underscores that building and maintaining trust in clinical trials isn't just a background task, it's absolutely essential for the future of evidence-based medicine. Improving the quality of the guidance itself is a critical foundational step.
Which really leaves you, the listener, with something to think about. Given that these vital areas like genuinely involving patients in the research process, making sure it addresses their needs and priorities, are often overlooked in the current integrity guidance. Well, what does that gap tell us about the priorities currently embedded in how we define and promote research integrity? Is the focus maybe too narrow right now?